everybody's exhausted after 3 days. Ivo.
Basically, what I hear is that there's very good work going on, but again, these are very nicely stovepiped, and I think we should bring them together and try to find whether we can get, you know, some sort of generalities brought together in terms of recommendation internationally. That's basically what I see, what's happening.
I'm sorry, the Netherlands? No, you. That's Tucker. Mr. Tucker? Right,
yeah.
Okay.
Too bad. Yeah, it does it. I think I briefly want to reiterate a point that I made in my own presentation. This is all great work. I mean, what Jacco is doing, what Lynn is doing, that is of course wonderful. But at the end of the day, you reconcile the trade database. And if we really want to build a global supply and use table or an import-output table, what we need to reconcile is the imports and the exports in all the supply and use tables together. And you cannot solve discrepancies that you find if you put all the supply and use tables. If you just add up all the exports and all the imports in all the supply and use tables and import-output tables that we have in the world, you see differences. Differences in the level of global trade, just regardless of the products. And you see larger differences at product level. And a trade database simply cannot solve it unless you say, I declare the trade database sacred and I allow them to override the trade in the supply and use tables. At that point, you have imbalanced supply and use tables and you violate actually the supply and use tables that have been made by the statistical officers. And you get very strange things. Actually, GTAP is, I believe, applying the approach of Lynn. It's maybe even be that you guys deliver these balanced trade data to GTAP. They then use these trade data to actually to say this is the trade between the countries, and they adjust the supply and use tables to that. And then one of my colleagues found things like that the trade of China, according to their system of national accounts reports, was, let's say, 30% of GDP. And according to GTAP, all of a sudden 35 or more. So you get these kind of things that you have to solve. And so you need, apart from having a balanced trade data set, you need to be sure that these trade numbers are reconciled with what is in the system of national accounts or supply and use tables. And then you really make big steps. But if you just reconcile trade, you still have a major job to do.
Okay. WTO?
Thank you very much. Oops. It's on the presentation, the source of discrepancies from WTO. We wished, I mean, perhaps it's in the paper, but it was not mentioned, that this information comes from administrative registers, as it was mentioned. And it's not only mistakes, I mean that, but according to WTO rules, countries have different custom valuation procedure they are allowed to apply. I'm not a legal specialist, but I remember there are at least 6 ways of evaluating goods at the import side. So this is a very, according to what the importing country will adopt, it will be different from the export value, and it's purely administrative. And if you go back in time, the discrepancy will be even higher, because before WTO, countries were able to use reference prices or domestic prices, which are no more allowed under WTO laws. But it was the case. So I mean, there are legal aspects. And I hope after that I may mention some legal aspect of moving from trade in merchandise to trade in services, because the governance in trade in services is much lower, and perhaps the USITC, who is working on anti-dumping, will be out of job because you can dump services.
Next, Michael.
I have the mic. There's just one comment I wanted to make, and that's in relation to the issue Ronald raised, and this is about whether the trade data needs to be adjusted for the national accounts, balance of payments, change in ownership principle. Now, I understand the IMF presentation is yet to come, so this makes it awkward. But I think we have to really insist that we follow the change in ownership principle, and that, in other words, the trade data reconciles fully with the national accounts measurement of exports and imports of goods, and also with the balance of payments. Otherwise, we risk just chaos or just different concepts in the measurement. And we touched on this yesterday in one of the presentations, and we are getting very strange measures precisely for that reason. I think that we are deviating away from a change of ownership in the trade data and just taking the trade data on a cross-border movement basis instead. I think it's really important for us to really nail that one down, because if we don't, there's a looseness about the whole measurement system, I think, and I don't think it will work. Thanks.
Good. Geraldo?
Yes, thank you. My comment is in the same wave of Michael Connolly. I think that it's important to give a robust basis, a solid basis, in the reconciliation between the BOP and the national accounts. So in this sense, I think that it's important to solve the issue of this reconciliation in order to advance for a SUT tables in a worldwide vision. The idea of this reconciliation, I think, is important, because if you don't have this solution, you need to define a strategy in order to advance. So my question, especially for Ronald, maybe for the international organizations, would be, what would be the strategy in the case of the countries that don't apply the recommendations and that don't have the reconciliation between BOP and national accounts? Why is important? In order to advance in the new conceptual framework that is that is now for advancing in the measurement of the globalization. Thank you so much.
Thank you. OECD.
I'm sort of glad that I'm going now after the interventions by others, but I wanted to make one first point. Whilst I welcome the discussion on this debate around supply use tables, I think it's important that we don't overcomplicate things. I mean, fundamentally, the presentations that we've seen today are about reconciling bilateral trade statistics. I mean, that's the key challenge, and we shouldn't miss that, and we shouldn't overcomplicate it by thinking about what the next steps are in terms of integration within supply use tables. The challenge, first and foremost, is reconciling trade data. That's key. The second challenge, of course, is to make sure that the underlying trade data can be reconciled with the national accounts and with the balance of payments data. That's another challenge. The third challenge is taking this reconciled trade data and integrating it into supply use tables. Now, of course, that's a very different matter, because ultimately it's about how you take the trade flow in the SNA, and we have no desire to see those changed. They are what they are, and we have to live with them, even if we don't like them, until the next revision of the SNA. And secondly, certainly in the context of manufacturing services, there's been a great deal of work been done to make sure that we have appropriate methods to record these flows, and we've had a lot of discussions about the conceptual basis of the recommendations. And whilst there is some discontent, and even myself sometimes I have unease about some of the recommendations that we made, they are the recommendations that we made, and we shouldn't be reviewing them.
Canada? Canada? Oh, you're getting here.
Thank you. Well, yes, I'll make two remarks related to both data confrontation and asymmetries. The first one maybe relates to the issue Steve brought up, and that's the bilateral reconciliation that we undertake as Statistics Canada with the Bureau of Economic Analysis on the balance of payments. Obviously, it's kind of a no-brainer. The U.S. is our biggest trading partner, also our biggest investment partner. So clearly that was one that we both agreed we had to target. And we've been doing such a reconciliation since about the mid-1990s. That predates my time in that part of the account, but roughly since that time. It's basically an annual reconciliation of the major components of the current account, but we've also extended that in more recent years to certain components of the financial account. Particularly, we've had some discussions about the FDI. It involves not only a bilateral data confrontation, but for some components of trade and services, there's an actual exchange of data, a counterpart exchange of data. We undertake the reconciliation. It used to be an annual process. Now we do it every 2 years, but 2 years at a time. So it's essentially a similar type of process. And we're rethinking that process all the time. We've talked about how we might try and improve that and streamline it going forward. Because as most countries can understand, it's an exercise that does cost in terms of time and resources. But then we still try and get together on an annual basis, and we typically use the second year to discuss data developments and particularly harmonization of our convergence to international standards. So I think that's also very useful when you've got significant trade and investment relations like Canada and the US have. Now, on to the other point, which I think Ronald brought up, which is some of the changes we're introducing actually in November, is something we called our Principal Trading Partners Project, where we've basically looked at applying the ownership principle to go beyond the 3 countries that we published on a quarterly basis in the balance of payments and the 3 regions, which is 3 regions including the rest of the world, to 27, actually approximately 30 principal trading partners, which accounts for the overwhelming proportion of Canada's trade. And in moving to the ownership principle, yes, we move from basically the merchandise trade principle of country of origin towards this consignment basis. And what it has done, it has significantly reduced bilateral data asymmetries in trade. And we're going to be publishing a paper on that very shortly. But we have really some information. And certainly, if you look at Canada's trade with China and China's trade with Canada, we've really moved quite a bit closer on a bilateral basis with China without much in the way of negotiation, just a simple statistical adjustment to our data. And we were fortunate to have the underlying information to be able to make that adjustment. So, yeah, on both parts, I think Canada's expressed a lot of interest in resolving bilateral data asymmetries, and we're certainly interested in some of the work that's going on at the international agencies and would be interested in pursuing this even further. Thank you. I don't know if
Any other interventions? Okay. Okay, I'll just ask the panelists if they could try and give us sort of a quick 1-minute response, or max 2, to the things that have been raised here.
I made a lot of notes. Thank you for the interventions. I think that's very helpful. Yeah, I think what we'd like to do is the following on the reconciliation of asymmetry. So first we reconcile the basic data, which is still the IMTS. So try to get some quality improvements there as much as possible. Which, by the way, if we use unit values, we have to be a little careful. I said that yesterday. So you might want to have to check, and especially also at national level, that the unit values which you are checking, which you are comparing, are actually reliable in that sense. But there is a lot to be done on the IMTS data, and then you go towards the adjustments to BOP. So there is, I think, I think a difference of opinion here. I think we'll go to the BOP SNA adjustments, but I think we should do it after we've done the reconciliation on the IMTS data. And then, of course, the further steps which Nadim also indicated. Just one more point I think I would like to add to what Pat was saying is that I think there is a data exchange, actual data exchange on the IMTS data between US and Canada before you start doing the reconciliation on the balance of payments and things like that. And I think that's also an important part to mention, is that there is a direct flow of basic data from one country to the other. And that might be, if that's possible between other countries, of course, something very useful. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. First to Arnold's remark, I think from our perspective, we can do one step in a series of long steps. And I think even if you say you make the supply use table the kind of the true north, and then go and work with trade data from there, I think it still would benefit you having more accurate trade data in terms of looking at if you're making the adjustments in the shares of the flows. But luckily that's not our job. On the reconciliation of the trade data, I think the big lesson for us has been in this work that the methodologically cleanest and the easiest way to do it is actually to do it at the level of the individual trade flow, rather than trying to do it at the country or sectoral level. And even countries that report high quality data, you will find data points in there which are far off anything that seems reasonable. And I think in our experience that simply has to do a lot with simple mistakes that happen in compiling very complex accounts. So I think going to an approach where you say, okay, country by country we give you a grade, or sector by sector we give you a grade, and then we use that to adjust, I think you get yourself into more trouble than you're solving. I think the last point that I wanted to make is that one question is, okay, how do you use this to reconcile data in official international statistics? But I think countries themselves can use these types of tools to assess the quality of their own data and build that into their compilation processes. And I think that there is potential to, for example, just ballpark check value, weight ratios, these kind of things as you're compiling statistics. And I think that in that process you can already reduce some of the discrepancies quite considerable, then making it easier afterwards to then sit together and say, okay, where do you need to harmonize reporting methods, how do you fix the rest of the very tricky problems that were mentioned before.
Lynn? Nothing, David? Okay, well, thank you. I think we heard a really interesting sort of range of methodology of adjustments, and an interesting discussion, and too, of when do we bring these into our accounts. In the U.S.-Canada case, they've been doing it for a while. In other cases, you may just use it for your trade and value-added estimates and your global supply and use tables for a while. So it may be a basis of consolidation. We hear also a plea, very important, I think, overriding argument in all of this is to make sure it links back to the common basis of our existing sets of S&A balance payments and other sets of rules we use now. View these as extensions. So I thank you very much, and we'll go on to our next panel. Okay, our first speaker, a little rearrangement here. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thomas.
Okay, Thomas Alexander is senior economist for the International Monetary Fund.
Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Actually, my presentation is going to be very brief. That in no way reflects the importance of the subject. It's just the scope of what I was asked to present on. The issue of the manufacturing services on physical inputs owned by others really came into prominence with the release of the 2008 S&A. And there's been quite a bit of discussion on the subject since then, and even before the release of the 2008 S&A. And I think Nadeem alluded to that a few minutes ago. From our standpoint, from the IMF standpoint, the importance of the subject is really related to the recording of international transactions in the balance of payments. I know there are a lot of implications of the new recording of the manufacturing services in terms of supply and use and input, output, and so forth, as we've discussed over the past few days. But this is more or less related to the international transactions recordings. The issue, again, we've discussed quite a bit over the past 2.5 days, is related to globalization, and I think we're all aware of the relationship between the manufacturing services and globalization, and the implications of the correct recording of manufacturing services and manufacturing in general. But the 2008 S&A and the BPM6 really took steps, significant steps to improve the recording of transactions as a result of what is happening with the global economy and trade and so forth. And related to this emphasis on is the emphasis on economic ownership and the broader application of change of economic ownership principle. And again, we touched on that briefly, I think, on Monday when Ivo mentioned the economic benefits and economic relationship of that economic ownership and so forth. Essentially, what the BPM6 and 2008 S&A did is really move away from the legal ownership, the broad recording use of legal ownership, to economic ownership. And in essence, this has implications for the recording of a number of transactions. One, as I said, one of the main ones is manufacturing services. So the stricter or the more comprehensive application of the change of ownership principle, or the change of economic ownership principle, means that goods exports and imports, or flows of exports and imports, are no longer imputed if there is no change of ownership of the goods, the exports and imports. And that is the key difference between the recording of merchandise trade statistics and the recording of trade and macroeconomic statistics, national accounts and balance of payments. And that if there is no change of ownership, the exports and imports are not recorded. Merchandise trade statistics takes a different view on this. And in essence, this is really, those of you familiar with the fourth edition of the balance of payments, this is really more or less back to the future, in a sense, because the BPM4, which was released in 1977, actually more or less was along these lines in terms of the change of ownership of goods. It really looked at recorded change of ownership, imports and exports of goods for processing if there was a change of ownership of goods. Now, in terms of the manufacturing service itself, manufacturing is recorded if you have a case where manufacturing is undertaken by a unit or an enterprise that does not own the goods. The only flow that should be recorded between the two units, or the two countries in that case, should be the processing fee, or the fee paid by the first unit to the second unit for processing these goods. Now, since balance of payment statistics in many cases, and the recording of goods in the balance of payment statistics really depends in many cases or in many countries on the merchandise trade statistics, it implies, therefore, that the recording of goods in the balance of payment statistics is really based in many cases on customs declarations, and that is what is used in most countries. The problem with that is that, as has been alluded to earlier, that recording does not provide a sound measure of manufacturing services, okay? Which, in a sense, is okay. It's okay in the sense that the customs declarations on the recording of merchandise trade statistics are different from the recording recommended in balance of payments and the national accounts manuals. And I know that I may raise eyebrows by saying it's a sense it's okay. And the reason why I say that is because we recognize that merchandise trade statistics as recorded by statistics offices from the customs declarations are recorded to meet a certain purpose, which is slightly different than what we do for balance of payment statistics. And I think it is clear in recording this that there is no effort to mislead compilers that this is what you're doing, this is being recorded in the change of ownership principle, when in fact it is quite clear in the merchandise trade statistics that what is being recorded is when the goods cross the border. So as long as we're clear on that, the issue then becomes how do we reconcile these two different data sets. But one good thing about the customs declarations is that it could actually, in many cases, provide some useful information in identifying the firms that undertake the processing. Okay, so even though we cannot use the data directly from the customs declarations or from the merchandise trade statistics, there is some useful information in there that we can use in order to reconcile the change of ownership principle. Now, why can't we use this the information from the customs declarations or the information from the merchandise trade statistics? That is because the difference between the values of goods before and after processing will not be the same as the value of the manufacturing service. And as I said, the manufacturing service is a fee for processing that is paid by the owner of the goods to the unit undertaking the manufacturing. And there are a number of reasons for that. I'll just touch on a few of them, but they are presented in our compilation guide. One that was mentioned by Ronald earlier that I do not have on this slide is that the fact that it is quite possible that the goods could be, after processing, could be exported to a third country and not returned to the country of the owner. Okay, and in many cases, very little of it may be returned to the country of the owner. Most of it may actually be exported to third countries, from the country of the processor to third countries. So if you're looking at the difference between the goods before processing and after processing, there's obviously going to be a discrepancy. The other one relates to the timing of the cross-period movements. The goods returned after processing may be returned in a different period, a different quarter or different year. So you really cannot look at the two and say that there is a relationship between the before and after. Another key one is in terms of holding gains and losses. Holding gains and losses in many cases related to oil production. That could cause an increase in the value of the goods after processing. That may not necessarily be related to any transaction, or that will not be related to a transaction or any processing. The inclusion of overheads, the only overheads that should be included are the overheads related to the processing. And the last one, I'll just go for problems in assessing the value of goods sent and returned. Since there is no sale, there is no transaction, there is no market, basically we're using whatever value, market value that is provided by the processor. And as we all know, this could change depending on who's doing the valuation. So how could we go about capturing this information on manufacturing services? It means, therefore, that we have to move away from for this specific activity or for this specific item, we have to move away from the merchandise trade statistics and the customs declarations and include in our data collection enterprise surveys to collect information on the firms that are engaged in processing. And as I said earlier, the customs declarations could provide information on which firms are engaged in processing, which firms are sending goods overseas for processing, and which firms are receiving goods after processing. So that could provide some information on the sample of firms that could be used for the survey. Another source used in some countries is the International Transactions Reporting System. The International Transactions Reporting System is more or less, in terms of a data collection tool, is more or less, in many cases, used basically for balance of payment statistics. And it's basically information collected on, well, international transactions, where enterprises and units provide a recording of all international transactions that they undertake. Some countries have used that data source to collect information on manufacturing services. Chapter 12 of our new Balance of Payments compilation guide provides some more information on how these items could be calculated. Now, the IMF has started to convert the data that it receives. Well, the IMF has started in 2012, started to release data on a BPM6 basis. All the data that we release on balance of payments are now on a BPM6 basis in the International Financial Statistics and the balance of payments database. So that implies that we are actively converting data of countries. Many countries have not converted from BPM5 to BPM6, and we have been undertaking that conversion ourselves. Now, the question that arises, why are we undertaking that conversion? Why are we converting the data of countries from balance of payments 5 to BPM6 basis? And here is the issue. When we released the Balance of Payments Manual in 2009, we encouraged countries to start to implement the BPM6 as quickly as possible. There are some countries that started. There are obviously lots of countries that are still lagging. So the question is, do we start, if we're going to ask countries to implement the BPM6, when they start to send us the data on a BPM6 basis, do we then tell them to reconvert the data back to BPM5? That was not an option. The second option is, do we publish some of the data on a BPM6 basis and some of the data on the BPM5 basis? That was not considered an acceptable option. So essentially what we were doing is we decided that we were going to convert everything. If we receive the data on a BPM6 basis, we publish as received. For the other countries, we convert from BPM5 to BPM6 basis. I think this brings us closer in terms of consistency than the wide gap that you would have in having data on a BPM5 basis and having data on a BPM6 basis. Much longer than I thought. No, I'm saying I'm speaking much longer than I thought I would. So we've been doing this conversion, and we have set formulas that we've been using, but we've encouraged countries to send us information on additional information that they may collect in order to assist us in that conversion process. Now, in the conversion process, we've been quite careful in deciding how we're going to convert, that we're not going to make changes to the balances, the current account balance, capital account balance, financial accounts, errors and omissions. So these remain the same basically. But in terms of the internal, the total values of credits and the total values of debits, there are some differences here. So the goods to processing were reclassified from goods to services as follows. And for some countries, they were already sending us detailed data, so we were able to use that detailed data in order to make this crude, for want of a better word, conversion. So for countries that we had the data available, processing the compiling economy, where we had information on goods returned after processing, less goods received for processing. Some countries actually sent us the data. And for processing abroad, goods sent for processing and goods returned after processing. Now this flies right in the face of what I said earlier, but we think it is much better than using classification of goods as in the balance of payments, as in the BPM-5. Now, not all countries actually provided that data. Not all countries provided this level of detail. So in cases where we just had values on goods for processing, we simply use the difference in the credit and the debit as manufacturing services and moved it from goods to services. To date, well, we currently publish data for 187 economies. And to date, there are 56 countries that currently report data on a BPM-6 basis. And of that 56, 28 record manufacturing services. What this clearly implies is that it's not important for all countries. It's a major issue, but it's a major issue only for some countries. It's very important for some countries. In other countries, it's not very important. And we expect by the end of 2014 to receive data from all 28 EU member countries, because the EU would have converted balance of payments to a BPM-6 basis. For the BPM-5 reporters, we still have 131 economies that report data on a BPM-5 basis. Out of that 131, 40 record goods for processing. And we've used the conversion process to convert for 46 of these countries. We receive data on a BPM-6 basis on a regular basis. We don't have anything scheduled for receiving the data. So far, we have an additional 15 countries that we're currently reviewing. So by the end of the year, this figure of 56 BPM-6 reporters is going to jump up quite a bit. Now, the BPM-6 implementation process is a gradual process. It's gradual across countries and it's gradual within countries themselves and within the data set. So in essence, in many cases where countries actually have implemented the BPM-6 and provided data on manufacturing services, the process that they may have used to estimate manufacturing services may not necessarily be the process that they may have maybe used in the next 5 years. Because countries are currently developing different processes and improving the data collection process in order to estimate manufacturing services. Some countries are still currently implementing enterprise surveys and so forth, or they have started to implement enterprise surveys, but they have not started to use information because they're still reviewing the information and so forth. But we continue to support countries. We'll continue to support countries in that regard. And in 2016, we are going to launch a new course that we will attempt to bridge the gap between the conceptual issue, which is pretty straightforward in terms of manufacturing services, and the actual problems that countries may have. Thank you.